was I going to say? We're encouraging written testimony, and there also will be the ability for anybody who wants to call a special phone line that every committee will have, where people can dictate their testimony up to 3 minutes. It's a Google transcription service. So that's a way that people can submit comments as well. That's process. The most important thing, I think, is the substance. I do not know what the budget's going to look like that the mayor submits next week. Our revenues have dropped by roughly $750 million. And so I have been telling folks that everybody should assume that if an agency about which they care, let's say DCPS, do not expect that there are going to be increases. Instead, I think the fight is to make sure that there aren't cuts. I did talk to the chancellor this morning, and I asked the chancellor what he could tell me about his budget. He actually said more than I expected. He said that they are trying, or that they will, I hate to put it so positively because he was unequivocal that school budgets will be held harmless. I just find that a little hard to believe. And now what that tells me is that if there are any cuts, it's going to be absorbed by Central. We'll know on the 12th. As I said before, we have to assume that every agency is going to be cut. And if they're lucky, they will get the same level of funding as last year. And so that means the kind of growth that we were expecting to see in DCPS is unlikely to occur, or in the charter schools as well. But we'll know the details next week. I think really at this point, the best thing is for me to just open it up for questions. Ebony Rose?
So I think the best way for us to take questions is actually for people to type it into the chat for two reasons. One is because it helps us keep a record later. Nora is excellent at minutes, but it's also excellent to have people kind of type in their word for word. And we can all see the chat function here. So I do want to make sure that we open it up for questions. I have a kind of a question to get us started. I'm not going to lead by example because I'm already talking. Do you all have a sense yet of how the reopening might affect the budget process and some of the things that, so like masks or gloves or like other protective equipment that wouldn't be in a school's budget, but now they're going to have to pay for due to the crisis? Like how, do you have a sense of how those things will be handled yet?
No, the short answer and the correct answer is no, but I can speculate a little bit. I do think that there are going to be more supplies necessary, both for schools as well as childcare centers, facilities, actually in a lot of places. And I think the government is expecting, well, with the agencies in the public sector, the government's going to have to provide that. I don't think that will come out of DCPS's budget. I think, and if it is proposed to come out of the budget, I would question that because I think that some of the federal dollars that we're getting would be available for that. I do think there'll probably be some savings and that there'll be less expense in the school if distance learning is continued into the fall. And my sense of it is that there's probably going to be some mix of distance learning and classroom teaching. Don't ask me what exactly that means. So I think there'll be some savings, but on the other hand, I think there'll be some expenses. Like if we're going to rely on internet technology for distance learning, we're going to have to spend more money to get the technology resources out into the homes that don't have them. So, and I don't know whether those expenses to savings are the same as the additional expenses or one's greater than the other. Don't know. But to get back to your question, if there is personal protective equipment or cleaning materials that are necessary, I would argue that that can come out of the federal money. I do see some chat room questions. Do you want me to turn to those?
Yeah, can we actually combine two questions? So one, the first question that came through was, is there a means which we can be apprised of the agenda of the reopening steering committee, which I actually think is related to a different question of any pre-discussion on what the reopening plan may look like for this fall. And then there's someone who said that they heard it might be August that schools would reopen. So I'm going to combine those into like one, because I feel like there are a couple bullet points that might go together.
You're going to have to remind me of the different components. With the reopen DC task force and the committees or subcommittees, I'm not responsible for the agenda, so I don't know where it's available, if it is available. With regard to the opening, I think one of the things we're going to find out in the next month or two is whether there's going to be summer school or summer school distance learning, whether next school year will start earlier. I think it's a fair question. What is the chancellor doing differently to catch up on the learning that was lost with distance learning? Did I miss anything, Ebony Rose?
There was a person who asked, so the questions were, am I still on mute? Okay. Is there
I see a question about hold harmless. I just mean by that, that's my own phrasing. I just mean by that if the school system, I forget what the DCBS budget was, but let's just say it was $1 billion, hold harmless would mean it would be $1 billion this coming year. That's what I mean by that. Because, you know, we were all hopeful when it looked like our revenue growth was going to be, what, $500 million, $500 million, that the UPSFF would go up 4%. And in fact, we'd fight over it going up higher. But now I think it's everything we can do to make sure that it doesn't go down. I'm going to say I don't think it's going to go down, but that's been what I've been saying to everybody with regard to every agency, that we hope it's level funding. And that's what I mean by hold harmless.
I see one of the next questions is from Marla about childcare. She's wondering why it hasn't taken more of a central focus in Reopen DC since it enables people to go back to work.
Well, Reopen DC is the mayor's agenda. So I don't know why childcare isn't taking more of a focus. And I do think that there's significant questions about how we're going to reopen childcare, because that's not exactly a socially distant setting. I've been part of several discussions recently about childcare, whether there are enough resources, whether the facilities are going to be able to survive. I don't have answers for any of that. I think that's true with a lot of what's going on. We just don't know. We're in uncharted territory.
I see the next question is from Laura. She asked how we set up accountability measures to ensure that DCPS and charter schools are being properly staffed, using social distancing, and have adequate cleaning supplies and procedures. Both sectors have a history of saying everything is fine and not having that.
Well, I think what we're going to see until we're fully reopened is that everybody is going to be told they have to abide by guidance from the Department of Health. So Department of Health is going to, what I expect is that Department of Health is going to issue guidance to schools as they reopen in terms of social distancing, or how to teach in a classroom, or cleaning, or testing. And yes, it's possible that a school, anybody who's skeptical on this call, it's possible that a school will disregard that guidance. But then again, there can be complaints, and this guidance will come from the Department of Health. That's my expectation. I don't think the city's just going to say, okay, schools can reopen and turn the switch. I think it's all going to happen gradually with guidance.
It looks like the next question is from Jock. Mr. Chairman, if the mayor does not propose a budget that is higher than this year's budget and increase, would you prioritize that budget proposal against cuts to other agencies?
Well, I think,
I'm assuming I'm assuming education. There should be a word that says education in there because it says other agencies. But
yeah, I'm not reading the question. I'm just listening to you. I think education is a higher priority than many other services that we provide. But the fact is that we're going to have a budget in which we have to reduce spending by about $750 million. The mayor is going to submit a balanced budget. Any place that we look to increase means we're going to have to find reductions elsewhere. This is very different than in the past where we were getting so much new money that it really was a fight over what to do with the new money. So it's going to be difficult. I can't give a simple answer to would I prioritize schools over other agencies. I would prioritize schools over most things, but without having seen the budget and to see what I'm thinking of the robbing Peter to pay Paul, what's getting robbed in order to help with education. Without knowing what that is, I can't really answer that question. And I want to impress on everybody that that's going to be the challenge with the budget. So if the mayor sends down a balanced budget in which he doubles the council's budget and cuts DCPS by the same amount, I think that's kind of easy. We'll just simply reverse the doubling of the council's budget and put it into schools. But I don't think it's going to be that simple.
we have a question from Ms. Kearney. What is the status of the Transportation Education Committee collaboration and potential solutions to support health and safety for students in the orange to lime phases? Do we have a lime phase? I know we have an orange phase in our education committee. We have an orange phase of reopening. So let me rephrase. What is the status of the Transportation and Education Committee collaboration? I'm going to assume during reopening, and any potential solutions to support health and safety for students?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Does the Transportation and Education Council committees?
I think, and Kearney, correct me if I'm wrong, I think what you're referring to is students have to travel to get to school. And with the reopening committees, I think she's wondering if the education and transportation committees are talking to each other at the committee level. Like you were saying, you had been part of some of the steering committee sessions. And if they had identified any potential solutions to keep students safe, healthy and safe in those first phases of reopening. That's how I understand it.
Well, they should be looking at that, but I got to tell you, I'm not quite sure how transportation is going to work with social distancing. I mean, think about it. If we want to keep people 6 feet apart, how do we fill up a school bus? And I'm not sure it's an option to have more buses. So I'm not quite sure how that's going to work. I think we're going to see in the short term some differences. And I think that's a reason why, as I understand it, the education task force of the Reopen DC is looking at a mix of distance learning and classroom learning, because I think we're going to find that there's still reasons like childcare or transportation or even parents, whether they can go to work, that we're still going to see some distance learning.
It might be, I mean,
we just don't know.
Yeah.
I was going to say, think about it. We know that there's not going to be a switch flipped and everybody goes back to the way we were on March 1st. So But we think in terms of what life was like on March 1st. And there were too many cars on the road, and we were trying to see if we could improve public transit. But now we can't put as many people on a bus because we've got social distancing. But then again, there probably aren't going to be as many cars, so maybe more people can drive. But then again, maybe not, like the federal government still emphasizes teleworking. Maybe there'll be more capacity on the transit system. And I hope I'm not coming across as not having answers, but I don't, because we're all trying to figure this out.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is helpful to share. I know that in the recommendation we've been working on as a committee, the last draft, and there's only been one draft, did suggest that LEAs have some kind of conversation with WMATA. I know in my feedback to the committee, I had some just questions about if they had more specific expectations around that. So like if there were times where LEAs had coordinated really well, or if that meant just some advice around how much transportation people needed. So like I know that in the mornings, those buses that go up East Capitol Street that a lot of students take to get to Eastern from Ward 7 are particularly crowded. It might be helpful if DCPS is identifying bus routes that are particularly crowded. We've talked about like A days and B days. So that is something that I know that there's a sense that needs to happen as far as coordination between transportation and education. We have not gotten into anything concrete around what that could look like. So that's not a helpful answer, but I can, as a committee member, try to continue to push for more clarity or examples, at least of people who have coordinated with WMATA well. I'm going to go on to the next question. When will Ward 7 and 8 receive the testing availability it needs due to disparate health outcomes? And that came from Marla.
Well, unfortunately, the testing availability is a problem across the city. The United Medical Center is a testing site. I do not recall offhand other testing sites. The city has been working to increase the testing availability. If any of you have been following national news, you know that testing is a problem across the country. There are apparently a few jurisdictions that have adequate material and supplies to do the testing. The district does not. Now, I don't know what the status is this week, but a week or two ago, the director of the Department of Health, Dr. Nesbitt, said that there was enough testing material for, I think it was 2 weeks, at the then rate of testing. The challenge is the chemical to test for the virus is called a reagent. I don't know why it's called that. It's called a reagent. There isn't enough reagent. There also are materials for testing like the swabs and kits. There hasn't been enough of that. And then there is, in order to do the test, the medical provider has to have personal protective equipment, and there hasn't been enough of that. I think at this point, the PPE is not as much a problem, but the materials are. My own view is that we should make testing available to everybody, regardless of whether they're symptomatic. Half the people on this call could have the virus and they don't know it. And they could be spreading the virus and they don't know it. And that's why I think that we ought to be testing or having testing available to everybody. Some people have already had the test. We don't know whether in fact you're immune, but we think you are, or we assume you are. So how many people on this call have the antibodies? We don't know. We don't know any of this. We're basically dealing with this pandemic half blind, maybe even 3/4 blind. And it's crazy. And that's not the fault of the district government. I blame the federal government for the lack of planning, the lack of stockpiling supplies, and just generally being difficult in helping the states to get what they need to do the testing. So the question was asked in terms of Ward 7 and 8. but it's really a citywide problem. I believe at this point, anybody can go to a doctor, call their doctor, and get a prescription, which is really, I mean, it's not really a prescription, it's just that you can then go and get tested. And I believe that all the hospitals are doing testing, and I believe there are a few other places you can get tested. And actually, and I should have said this earlier, if you go to the city's website, coronavirus.dc.gov, you should be able to get information about where to get tested, where one can get tested.
I'm going to go to the next question, who's from Lorraine. And she wants to know how DC will lead the way to help teachers truly teach students at a distance, technology for all students, along with infrastructure changes in the community to handle the influx of people online at the same time. So she's curious about what supports are available for teachers with distance learning, and then if we've done anything to upgrade our technology infrastructure to support the load of people being in communities online at the same time.
In my conversation with the chancellor this morning, we asked about this and what they're doing with distance learning. And we got a long answer with a lot of information. In terms of whether the technology is adequate, my sense is that it is. Is it available? That's still a challenge, which the city's working on, and with the federal money, that ought to help, but that takes some time. My sense is that the distance learning is going better here than in some other jurisdictions. Some of you may have heard in the news last week or 2 weeks ago about Fairfax County basically imploding with its distance learning. And I don't wish ill on anybody, but it's kind of nice to know that a jurisdiction like Fairfax County can do things badly sometimes, while we seem to be doing okay. But I am personally deeply skeptical that distance learning can take the place of classroom teaching. And where I think it is more problematic is in the equity context. The families where the child doesn't get the parental support that you might see in an affluent family, and that with this, now that you've got distance learning, how's that going to work? The households that don't have the IT infrastructure. So, as I said, I think distance learning is a poor substitute, but it's the only substitute we have for the classroom, and that it's exacerbating the achievement gap or learning gap.
As a follow-up question to that, the next question in the queue was actually, do we know how many students are still lacking technology? And do you know if there's a clear plan to get that to them?
I'm not sure. I'm going to turn to Lakeisha. You've been involved in some conversations. Do you know if we have a sense of how many students are still lacking technology?
Still lacking, no. What the chancellor said this morning was that DCPS has given out 7,500 devices. They prioritized high school students first. They are now at elementary school as well. So going through middle school and elementary school students. DCPS has a total of 16,000 devices through the technology funds that they received. So the chancellor even said this morning that, I mean, as much as 500 devices can be given out this week, and that includes laptops or tablets and hotspots as well. And they're working with, I believe, T-Mobile and I want to say Comcast to try and internet to the students that are lacking it as well through the equity fund purchasing hotspots. So DCPS believes that they have the amount of devices to cover all of the students that will need them. And they are giving them out at, I believe, at their meal sites. And they also have some technology distribution specific sites where families can come and pick up devices if they need them.
Thank you. So I'm sure that there's some gaps, and some gaps and some glitches, but my sense of it is that the system is getting the technology out.
Okay, I am. So people know I'm trying to be as fair as possible and kind of going through the questions in order. Kearney asked, he mentioned the need to hear less about childcare and more from K-12. What level and issues specifically were you interested in hearing about? Were there any concerns for high school?
I'm seeing the question. I'm not sure I understand it. You hear a lot more K through 12. I sort of agree that, you know, my feeling is that we need to focus more on elementary school, because elementary school is key to kids learning so that they can do well in middle and high school. And I think it's a little unfortunate that the elementary schools are the last place that are getting the last to be getting the hotspots and other IT devices. I'm not sure how else to answer that question.
Okay, maybe there'll be a follow-up. I'm going to read the next, which seems more like a comment, but I'll still read it so it goes on the record. This is not specifically for the chairman, but going back to East of the River principal firings, they aren't all for the same reason, but opposition to the relay approach seems to be relevant to more than a couple. I would like the W7 Ed Council and Council to look into it, because as it is being implemented in schools, it sounds like the prime example of deficit thinking and school to prison pipeline supporting practices, especially since well-respected principals who oppose it have been removed. So that was not a question, but I want to make sure that that was elevated out of the chat.
Sure. Well, let me say something about that. I asked the chairman the chancellor this morning about the termination of the principal at Boone, and I believe there are two other schools, both of which east of the river, Burrville and Kimball. I don't fully understand what's going on, and he didn't explain it more. The chancellor's reluctant or won't talk about the details of any personnel issue. He seems comfortable that the issue was a personnel one, although I know from the community that they think it's tied to relay. And I just don't have a sense whether that's coincidence or whether that's in fact a factor. You know, my concern with principals is that, first of all, for a school to grow and continue on the path of growth, there needs to be stability. And that means you can't be going through principals. I find it really disturbing when I look at a school and see that they've had 3 principals in 4 years. I don't think that's the case with Boone. In fact, I think that principal's been there for 4 or 5 years. And so this is destabilizing to that school, and that's concerning to me. I'm also concerned about multi-year contracts for principals, and that came up briefly in my conversation with the chancellor this morning, because I think multi-year contracts is another way of getting stability with principals, but that wasn't the issue at Boone, or I think at Kimball or at Burrville. I don't know more, and I also am concerned. I don't understand why. My understanding is it's 3 or 4 schools that had principals that were let go, and at least 3 of them are east of the river, and that's of concern to me.
Yeah, so I stated at the top, and some people probably may have joined late, which schools we have transitioning as far as, or we have confirmed the principal is transitioning or has been asked to transition, whatever the language is.
It's a very polite, yes.
I try to be polite. I was raised that way. So we have Houston, Kimball, C.W. Harris, Houston, Kimball, C.W. Harris, Burrville, Ron Brown, And then we also have Orr and Simon that are in Ward 8 that we know of thus far. I shared earlier that the principal meeting, the community meeting for Kimball was today. And then I believe the other ones that are in Ward 7 are next week. We've not seen a comprehensive list yet. Like I don't think DCPS has posted it in any one place, but they have been sharing information with school communities. So that's been bubbling up that way. And some, like I know we have a couple commissioners on the line, like they've been really good about sharing it on listserv so community members know that these transitions are happening or proposed to happen. So we have 5.
Are these transitions voluntary or involuntary?
I'm sorry?
Ebony Rose, are these transitions voluntary or involuntary?
I can't actually know for all 5. I do think, as the comment stated, that they're not all the same situation. We have had actually years where we've had a greater number of principals turn over. Like I know one year we had 7 principals that turned over in 1 year. We do have a couple principals in that group at C.W. Harris, at Kimball, at Houston, who have been there for several years. Principal Seward's community letter did mention that he was retiring. We've not been given, and then I believe the principal, Ron Brown, stated that he wanted to transition. This is his 4th, technically 5th year if you include the planning year at Ron Brown. But for the other ones, we haven't been given a rationale. I unfortunately missed the Kimball community meeting earlier today, but I'm going to check in and see kind of what came out of that. But we've not been given a rationale or a reason. My anticipation would be that DCPS's initial reaction would be to share with us that those are personnel issues and not try to go further than that. But that doesn't mean that there isn't more information. And I would say, and I should say the Burville principal, we do know that he's not been in that building since the fall because that was the same school with the meningitis issue and like notification of parents. So there's actually been an interim principal in place. So I believe this is an opportunity for the Burville community to select a permanent principal, which may or may not be the interim principal that they have. So those 5 are different situations. But we haven't been given any communication other than that from DCPS.
So I look at it 2 ways. One is that if it's voluntary or involuntary, and the other way I look at it is that it's destabilizing regardless. And I'm not sure what else to say other than that's of concern. I don't know how a school gets better if it's got turnover at the top.
Yeah, I have a correction. Sharon let me know Burville will not be affected because they have an interim principal. So I think what people had heard before was about Principal Taylor, who's gone. So I guess they're keeping their interim. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, I know our board has had some concerns about stability as well, and has raised the question, given this, just the amount that we don't know during this time, kind of, is this the best time to switch leadership, regardless of the reason? Like, it's got to be a really, really good reason, because there aren't a lot of things that are holding kids stable right now. And so I want to make sure I convey that because my board has brought that up to me several times. And so I want to speak from their point of view as well. I'm going to try to get in a couple more questions because we're at 7:25. Laura asked a good one, which is there any talk about raising revenue by increasing taxes, especially on large corporations, major developments, and the wealthiest residents of the district to close the shortfall?
Well, I am hearing that question from some very liberal groups like DC Fiscal Policy Institute. I don't think that's, I think that's a simple answer that is not a long-term solution. To come up with $700 million is an awful lot in tax increases, particularly when we're in a recession. So I'm sure that we're going to hear this debate as the budget is before the council. I'm looking at the question, especially on large corporations. I don't know that the tax rate on businesses distinguishes, and I think we're seeing all kinds of corporations that are suffering. So I don't know that that's the go-to place. Macy's, I don't want to say Macy's is looking at bankruptcy, but I heard a week or two ago that Macy's is seriously struggling with this recession. They're a big corporation. So I don't think there's an easy answer with corporate taxes. And wealthiest residents, I know there's some talk about that because I've heard that from some other groups that have asked that question. That's not going to get us to $700 million. So I think the district, it's true to say that we're struggling because of this recession and the fact that our revenues this current fiscal year are down 7%. And next year they're down, $750 million. But last year, we came off of last year in such a strong position that we're in a better place than most jurisdictions in this country. There's states that are looking at the possibility of insolvency and cities that are probably going to go bankrupt. And we don't have that problem. We're going to be able to solve our budget without having to make major cuts. I said before, because I don't want people to be thinking about how, this is a time when we can expand spending. But at the same time, I think that I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to get to this budget without major cuts. So that was a long answer to that question.
I'm going to ask, I think this is Winsette's question, because she asked, will teachers be required to be tested before entering schools? That's a good question.
It is a good question. I don't know the definitive answer. My sense is probably. But remember, you can be tested today and be infected tomorrow. And I am not siding with the president's press person who yesterday said, therefore, we don't need to test anybody. I think instead it means that we need to be testing and testing more. I believe in universal testing.
All right, I'm scrolling because I'm doing my best to either skip people's responses or things that we've already elevated. Reading the chat. Kearney asked a question, since Ron Brown is a citywide school, does that mean they will have to wait to the later phases, given some of the transportation concerns to return to school?
I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know that anybody has an answer to that. I would hope that we are not picking and choosing schools, that we're taking a broader approach. This is how we're going to reopen high schools, not this is how we're going to reopen Wilson as opposed to Ron Brown.
Okay.
I want to go back to the tax question, because I see there was another person who wrote, seconding Laura's question, do you support higher taxes on the rich, especially the ultra wealthy, to help pay for what we need to actually pursue equity in the district? And if not, how do we keep the social safety net from bottoming out? Well, there's several things in that question. I said before, we're not going to solve this problem by taxes. And I'm not saying that there will be no tax changes, but I'm saying that that's not how we're going to solve this problem. But the second part of that question suggests that our income tax is not progressive. We made changes to our income tax 5 years ago that made our income tax the most progressive in the country. And when I say progressive, that means that rich people pay a higher proportion of their income on income tax to the district than poor people do. And then the third part of this is, how do we keep the social safety net from bottoming out? My concern is that we keep the social safety net from being cut. And then as we come out of this, we look to continue growing the social safety net. One of the reasons why I feel passionate about our improving education is because I think that's the long-term solution to the safety net, that we teach people well enough that they can get the good jobs and that they can build the wealth and they can overcome the equity issues. Education is a key to doing that. But in the short term, I think everybody has to be vigilant that we're not cutting, but I think that I think we've come into this recession strong enough that we don't have to worry about the safety net bottoming out. Ebony Rose, a couple more questions.
I feel like some of these things are comments, but we've had a couple people add into the chat testing locations, and so if it's helpful, we can share that out like in the notes or like on our social media and other places, because there were questions about where people can get tested.
Go to coronavirus.dc.gov. That's got more information on it than you can imagine.
It does have a lot of information.
Testing sites.
We've also had a couple people chime in about the principal turnover. Someone corrected me. Burville Shantia Pilgrim will be the permanent principal. She's currently the interim principal. And that the Boone principal, that's Ward 8, she has appealed to DCPS. I guess she sent a letter. So we know that that's not a voluntary separation. And a couple other people said that the ones in question that are remaining, so that would be the ones in question are also involuntary. We did get a question about, last question has been about why are librarians being cut from the school system's budget?
Gosh, that goes back to the pre-public health emergency, so I have to dig into my memory. My recollection was that I talked about this, David Grasso and I discussed this with the chancellor, and that the DCPS policy had not changed. I'm sort of looking to see if Lakeisha is nodding her head if I've got this right. The DCPS policy had not changed. There are some schools that, so this issue seems to have gotten spun up a bit. And while I'm saying it's gotten spun up a bit, at the same time, I think librarians are important in schools. And part of my conversation with the chancellor was, well, can a principal just decide to sacrifice the librarian for something else that isn't as good? And he assured me that there is a review at Central. Now, I think we have to keep looking at this to see what actually happens this year. I'm willing to get into the oversight questions, although with the pandemic, the council's ability to do oversight is really cut back. I'm willing to get into the oversight questions, but I'm less willing to get into prescribing exactly what the schools should be doing. I think schools should have librarians. I think librarians are important to learning. I don't know what's going on in the schools, as in how many schools are going to next year not have librarians who had them this year. And then I would ask the question, why? So these are oversight questions. Why? Why did a particular school get rid of the librarian? And what did they get instead? And if we see that there were some good choices made, maybe that's okay. And if there were bad choices made, then we put pressure on the chancellor. But for the council to get in and legislate, every school should have a librarian. Now, I know nobody suggested that, but I'm hesitant about that. And if we legislate librarians, then do we legislate 2 social workers for each school? And you know, there are other courses that are not core academics. Do we start legislating them? So I think this is more for oversight, and it's something that we're going to try to explore as we go through the budget process.
So I saw Laura nodding her head that yes, we should have 2 social workers. We should legislate that. but I actually do have a question. And
Two
this might,
Lauras in every school.
I'm sorry.
I said maybe we should have 2 Lauras in every school.
I don't know if we can legislate that, but maybe we should. I'm curious. There was a lot of talk when DCPS was doing its budget meetings much early on about redoing the comprehensive staffing model for DCPS. Do you know if that's something that's still on the table, or has that taken a back burner with everything else that's happening in this, during this budget process?
My sense that none of these important issues have taken a back burner, but a lot of them have been getting less attention and have slowed down. That comprehensive staffing model does need to be looked at, because I think that's a mistaken way that we're doing the budgeting on the school level. I have time for one more question.
So I see we're now up to 7 Lauras in every school. I don't see a question. I do see a comment. With mayoral control, we really need the council to help everyday parents and community members hold the chancellor and DCPS accountable to make sure the school system is acting in the best interest of our children and communities. Was there a final question that I missed? If so, you might want to put it in the chat, because I've gone from top to bottom.
Let me just say this. A reason why the committee as a whole has co-jurisdiction on education is because I do think there needs to be better oversight. And I would like to think that the oversight has improved. Now remember, oversight is not the same as performance, in the sense that we can have oversight hearings with, I don't want to talk about DCPS right now. There's some other agencies that have been really, really horrible places, and we have oversight hearings, and that doesn't change their behavior. But oversight's important, and because of that, I've gotten more involved. The committee as a whole is more involved with oversight.
Okay. So we have I guess this will be, can I just tell you the last 2 questions and then we will cut it off? No matter what people put in the chat. The last 2 that kind of trickled down as you were talking were, when do DCPS school budgets need to be submitted? And when do they need to be finalized? Which is really straightforward. And the other is, can't council do anything to look into reinstating principals at Kimball and other schools?
Let me take the last one first. You don't want elected officials to be making decisions regarding who is a principal. That's not the same, though, as elected officials, the council, asking questions through oversight. And I have brought this up with the chancellor, and I'm continuing to think about whether we're getting the full story and what more we can do. We talked about this earlier, the destabilizing. Why is it that so many schools east of the river? I think these are important questions. With regard to the school budgets, the impression I have from the chancellor in my conversation this morning is that the school budgets are the school budgets that were worked out in February and March. And so I don't expect they need to be submitted again before we get the budget, which will be next week. It is probable that after the council votes on the budget June 30th, that there will be some reworking of the school budgets. If there's any reworking of the school budgets before then, I would be seriously concerned. Why is DCPS messing with the school budgets after they submitted them to the council? Okay. So I'm going to thank you all very much for taking the time to be here and inviting me. And I'm happy to come back anytime. Please forgive me for getting off now, but I have other commitments. So I'm going to leave the meeting. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for joining us. All right. We are at 7:40. Typically at the end, so, and I don't know if people had other questions. If you do have other questions, I would encourage you to either questions or especially comments about the reopening in the budget. Please send them our way, because I know that sometimes I might leave something and then I'm like, nobody answered this. I will say for the reopening in particular, we are still accepting feedback, even though that process is moving fairly quickly. So written things are best because as a committee member, I can just pass them on. What time do you need additional questions by? We are supposed to be getting a draft as the education committee sometime this evening. They have not told us yet, because I don't believe that draft is coming to my email. Let me look in case something changed. Nothing changed. Typically, they give us a turnaround that is fairly short. When the draft comes in, we normally have until sometime the next day to give any feedback. So I would say if there are general things you're concerned about, whether that be distance learning, when we're going to reopen, what protective equipment people have, the list goes on and on. Don't just shoot me an email. That's been most effective. We do have a drive that we're using to upload information. And so I've just been kind of uploading things as they come to me. If you have some feedback or a comment that you want to keep anonymous, let me know that, because if not, I'm good for just turning the email into a PDF and putting it in the folder just because of the volume of information. And it's helpful to show what people are actually saying, or if people are saying something over and over. So I don't think we had, I'll ask the board if there was anything I forgot to cover today. Laura, Nzinga, Marla, I saw Greg. Is there anything I missed? That we were supposed to share? It's been a really long day for me, y'all. That's why I'm asking. Nobody's telling me yes, that I've missed something. I'm happy. We typically meet until 8. And Zinga asked, did we make announcements? Yes, we did make announcements. We did make an announcement about elections. I'll restate in case people weren't on the line then, and also in case, and because we started the recording late, so that way people will know if they view the recording. We did have to put out to the body, well, I guess we didn't have to, but we chose to put out to the body because it's the right thing to do, a question of if we were going to have elections in the spring. Our bylaws do state that we are supposed to have elections in specific months, but they also state you're supposed to have them in person. We can't have elections in person, and we typically meet in public spaces. Most public spaces are closed, so there's a bunch of barriers to us doing elections the traditional way. For people who don't know, it is not our full board that goes out, it's half of our board that goes out at a time. This year that would have been our vice chair, corresponding secretary, and treasurer. We do currently have people in all 3 of those positions, and all 3 of them have agreed to stay on in those positions until we can have elections. We put out a survey we brought this up at the last meeting because we had looked at our bylaws and we know this is something we do every year. So we put it out at the last meeting for feedback, but we also did a survey and we sent it in several of the mailings leading up to say, like, what do people think? What should we do? Should we do online elections? Or should we wait until we can come back together and do elections? We got maybe 22 responses. I will say currently, I believe we have maybe upwards of 60 members. And when I say members, those are people who have paid dues. So less than a third of our membership chimed in. But it literally was half and half. We had 11 people that said, we think you should do virtual elections. And we had 11 people that said we should wait. I will also say that of the people who asked us to do virtual elections, they also asked if there were other things we could do to make it more democratic, like mail people ballots and some other things that we don't have the capacity to do. So as a board, we decided the best course for us would be to hold elections when we can come back together. Those board members have volunteered to stay on. And I will say so you have some insight into our thinking. We made that decision for a couple different reasons. The first is that we think it's the most democratic option. We have raised a lot of issues with DCPS and other LEAs around just digital divide. I don't know why that would be any different in Ward 7 for adult people. And so we know that we're limiting some membership if we only do online elections. So that was the first reason. The second reason is because just like because it's not a great time to kind of have to transition, and we don't know how much notice we could get out to people and in onboarding new board members. So we decided it would just be best to kind of keep pace and pay attention to a lot of the things that are coming down the pike. Our bylaws do allow the board to make that decision. And any members who have asked, we made this offer during the meeting last week, and I believe we followed up on it pretty well. Any members who have asked to see the bylaws, we've sent them a copy of the bylaws so they could take a look, but we did want to get people's feedback. So we believe this was the best way as far as both being transparent, that it was a decision that had to be made, seeking feedback, and then coming to people like with our rationale for a decision. I'm happy to take any questions about that, but I also wanted to let people know that was the decision we made. So are there any questions about that? Okay. Are there any other announcements? And they could be announcements that maybe somebody showed at the top but wants to share again, or anyone who didn't get to do an announcement at the beginning, because we will share that we are recording and we will share it out.
I guess if you came on late, so my name is Ashley Kearney. I kind of made an announcement in the beginning in terms of like Ron Brown just figuring out that we're going to have our principal update this Friday and or Monday in terms of the instructional soup letting us know. And then the last announcement I made was that to support Ebony Rose and the other committee members with receiving data specific to Ward 7, we were able to convene a focus group at our school to provide some perspective on what would it take or what concerns parents and students and teachers and other staff members had. We represented 9 out of 15 groups that we surveyed and talked to.
Thank you for taking time to do that. Any other announcements?
I'll share really quickly. It's Natalie Smith. I don't know whether now would be a good time to share. Sorry, you hear my 3-year-old in the background. Global Citizens Public Charter School received conditional approval on March 23rd to open a dual language immersion school with Mandarin and Spanish paths in either Ward 7 or Ward 8. With that said, we are in the process of like trying to serve our community the best. And so we were offering gift cards for meals for families who attended our classes. We have just a little bit left. And so if anybody needs gift cards for meals, we don't have many, but I do want to offer some out. And so I'm gonna just drop my email if I can in the chat, and people can email me to let me know of any needs, if anybody would benefit from a gift card for some meals. If that's okay. Is it okay for me to type my email?
Yeah, if you want to also just drop in the name of the school, because I see someone has asked a question, what is the name of the charter school that was approved?
Oh, sure, I can do that. Thank you.
And thank you, Jess, for reminding us to say Happy Teacher Appreciation Week. My mother has claimed it as a month, but I don't know if she could just do that by herself. Allison says, Happy Teacher Appreciation Week. We miss y'all. Any other announcements before we sign off? I'm all for found time, you guys. All right, it looks like we can adjourn early for once, and that woman is not banging on the library door, so that's awesome. That makes me happy. It's 7:51. We can adjourn the meeting. We will have one final meeting, which will probably also be a virtual meeting in June. If people have suggestions or topics for that meeting they're interested in, please send us an email. We love suggestions. But we will adjourn for the evening. Thank you, everyone, and hopefully you are staying safe. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.